On the late-night flight from Los Angeles to New York, Jace Carter had expected nothing more than a few hours of quiet. He just needed a moment to forget his bitter defeat, being kicked out of a project he had put his heart and soul into. But life rarely goes according to plan. A small argument in the front cabin caught his attention, a haughty-looking woman, a child quietly pushed aside. Jace had never cared for strangers, but this time he felt something different. Little did he know, his small decision that night would change everything. The dim yellow lights in the business-class cabin cast a warm, hazy glow over the leather seats, like an unfinished dream. The quiet sound of pages being flipped, combined with the monotonous voice of the flight attendant, created a monotonous soundtrack. Jace leaned his head against the cold window, his eyes glued to the sparkling lights of Los Angeles, which were slowly shrinking into tiny dots in the pitch-black night. He wanted to sleep, to bury the terrible day he had just had, the day his colleagues, people he once called friends, had dismissed him from a project he had worked hundreds of hours on. But sleep did not come. Instead, a sharp voice rang out, cutting through the silence. "I booked business class. This must be a mistake." Jace opened his eyes and tilted his head slightly. In the front of the cabin, a woman with long blonde hair, her hair in a high ponytail, wearing a shiny leather jacket, was facing a flight attendant with her arms crossed. Her red lips were pressed tightly together, her eyes flashing with undisguised irritation. Next to her was a skinny boy, about 10 years old, wearing a loose blue sweater, his hands clutching the straps of his old backpack, as if clinging to a fragile support. He stood still, saying nothing, his eyes looking down at the floor as if trying to avoid everything around him. "Ma'am, according to our system, the boy's ticket is economy class," the flight attendant replied, her voice professional but slightly nervous. "No way." The woman Jace assumed was his mother snapped, her voice high-pitched. "I booked both business class seats. I don't have time for stupid mistakes like this." The boy stirred, but did not raise his head. His thin shoulders shook slightly, as if he were used to storms like this. Jace watched, and a strange feeling washed over him. The boy was not surprised, not protesting. Perhaps this was not the first time he had been pushed aside. "I can sit down there, Mom," the boy whispered, his voice as small as the wind blowing through the crack in the door. The woman frowned, looking annoyed by the nonsense. She didn't even look at her son, just sighed impatiently, pulled her phone from her bag, and waved at the flight attendant. "Okay, bring him downstairs." In just a few seconds, the boy walked silently, dragging his rumpled backpack, his small figure disappearing down the narrow aisle leading to the economy class. The woman sat down in her seat, not once looking back, as if the boy had never existed. Jace frowned. The business class cabin was quiet again, the steady hum of the plane's engines, but something inside him had just broken. He didn't know why he was paying attention. He had never been the type to meddle in other people's business. His own life was already in turmoil. But as the image of the boy walking away silently flashed through his mind, he felt a nameless unease rise up. He told himself to just close his eyes and it would all be over. But his hands, as if with a will of their own, tightened their grip on the arms of the chair. Jace leaned forward, his eyes following the woman. He now heard the flight attendant call Vivian Kingsley as she gathered her things with obvious irritation. She stood tall, her expensive silk dress hugging her body, showing off her undisguised pride. But her eyes never once touched the boy who stood still in the middle of the aisle, small and lost in the pale yellow light. His large round eyes were filled with deep sadness, his skin as pale as if it had never seen sunlight. "Miss Kingsley, please downgrade to economy. We will do our best to accommodate you," the flight attendant said, her voice gentle but firm. Vivian snorted coldly, her lips pressed into a straight line. She bent down to pick up her bag, then turned and walked away without a word to her son. The boy still stood there, motionless, like a statue forgotten in the midst of the passing people. Jace felt a heat rising in his chest, a smoldering fire that would not be extinguished. A 10-year-old should not look so resigned, so unconcerned, so angry, so helpless. Before he could think further, his feet were on their own, walking toward the boy. "What's your seat number?" he asked, his voice low but not distant. The boy looked up, his amber eyes wavering for a moment but quickly regained their strange calm. 32B. Jace glanced at Vivian, who had disappeared, then back at him. His patience, the way he stood there without complaint, made him shiver. He turned to the flight attendant, his voice firm. "I'd like to change seats for the boy." The flight attendant blinked, surprised. "Sir, actually." "I'm changing seats," Jace interrupted, pulling a ticket from his jacket pocket. "My seat is 3A. After a few seconds of hesitation, the flight attendant nodded. "If you are sure, we will update the system." Jace leaned down, looking at the boy. "Come on, kid." The boy, Theo, he could hear the flight attendant looking at him, his eyes pondering something deeply. Finally, he nodded slowly and followed. As they sat down, the plane taxied, the roar of the engines drowning out all other sounds. Jace closed his eyes, trying to clear his mind of the chaos, but the image of Theo's eyes, deep, quiet, filled with unspoken sadness, still haunted him. Beside him, Theo sat upright, hands on his knees, not curious about the screen in front of him, not as excited as the other kids when the plane took off. Only his thin shoulders shook slightly, very slightly, as if he was hiding something. The night sky outside the window was pitch black, except for the blinking lights on the wings of the plane like stray stars. The Boeing 787 glided through the clouds, the passengers in the business class slowly falling asleep, leaving behind the steady breathing and distant engine noise. Jace leaned his head back against the seat, trying to relax, but an uneasy feeling crept into his chest like a premonition of an approaching storm. Then a faint sound came, a wheezing, rapid, weak breath. Jace opened his eyes. Theo was hunched over, his hands gripping the chair, his chest heaving violently. His lips were pale, his dark brown eyes filled with silent panic. "Asthma." "Follow?" Jace jumped up, his voice urgent. The boy did not answer, only gasped, his breath coming in weak gasps. Jace turned, his voice cutting through the air. "Stewardess, someone help!" The passengers around stirred. A few curious glances turned, a few whispers rang out. A flight attendant ran over, her face pale with panic. "What happened?" "The boy had an asthma attack," Jace said quickly, his voice low but urgent. "Got any medicine?" The flight attendant shook her head, eyes wide. "We'll check it out. Please keep the boy calm." But Theo couldn't calm down. He was struggling for breath, his throat hissing like a strangled wind. His eyes looked to Jace, silently pleading for help, tears welling in the corners of his eyes. Jace's heart clenched. He had felt this way years before, as a child, when asthma attacks made the world feel closed in, the air a traitorous enemy. He couldn't stand to watch another second. Jace dug into his bag, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the familiar inhaler he'd carried since the old days. "Take slow, deep breaths," he said, placing it in Theo's hand. The boy trembled as he obeyed, beat by beat, once, twice. His breathing steadied, though still weak. Jace relaxed, but his heart was still pounding like it was trying to break out of his chest. Vivian rushed in from below deck, her face pale and her blonde hair tangled. "What just happened?" Jace looked at her, his eyes cold and angry. "Your son almost died right in front of you." The air in the cabin was tense. Vivian stood frozen, clutching her designer handbag, her blue eyes wavering between panic and pride. Her golden hair was slightly disheveled, a rare sign of haste. "Theo, are you okay?" she asked, her voice strained, as if she wasn't used to the concern. Theo nodded weakly, but his eyes never left Jace, as if searching for something to lean on. "You didn't know your son had asthma?" Jace asked, his voice low but sharp as a knife. Vivian stiffened, her eyes flashing with anger. "Of course I know, but it doesn't happen often." Jace sneered, humorless. "Does the boy have any medicine?" She was silent, her hands trembling slightly. The silence said it all. "The boy survived by luck this time," Jace said, his voice even but heavy. "What about next time?" Vivian took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. "Who do you think you are to judge me?" "The one who just saved your child," Jace replied without blinking. She opened her mouth to protest, but her words caught in her throat. Theo lowered his head, his hands tightening on the hem of his shirt, as if trying to escape this suffocating moment. Vivian lifted her chin, a last defense. "I don't need anyone to teach me how to be a mother." Jace tilted his head, his eyes cold. "Since the beginning of the flight, I haven't seen you show even 1 ounce of concern for the boy." She froze, her eyes wavering, but didn't answer. Jace turned away, not wanting to waste another word. He put his hand on Theo's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Get some rest, kid." Theo looked at him, his eyes filled with gratitude and a deep sadness, as if no one had ever touched him this way before. Jace leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, trying to push away the anger that still simmered inside him. But he knew that tonight had changed everything, and his instincts told him that this wasn't the end of the story. The plane landed at JFK in the gray morning light. The morning mist was thick on the runway, and weak rays of sunlight penetrated the heavy clouds. The steady sound of the loudspeaker announcing the departure of passengers pulled Jace out of his chaotic thoughts. He unbuckled his seatbelt and glanced at Theo. The boy had fallen asleep after the panic attack, but his sleep was restless, his eyelids trembling, his breathing still labored, as if carrying invisible nightmares. Vivian sat a few seats away, silent since the incident. Her blue eyes were distant, her fingers absent-mindedly fiddling with the silver necklace around her neck, as if she was struggling with something inside. Jace paid her no mind. He stood up, grabbed his luggage from the overhead compartment, and prepared to leave. But as he turned, a hoarse voice rang out, "Uncle Jace." Jace stopped and turned. Theo was awake, looking at him with tired eyes. The boy hesitated as if he wanted to say something big, but finally he just whispered, "Thank you, Uncle." Jace smiled, a small but genuine smile. He reached out and patted the boy's head. "You're welcome, kid." Vivian watched from afar, her eyes complicated, but she did not speak. Jace did not wait any longer. He turned and joined the crowd rushing towards the exit, thinking that this was the end of a strange night. Then a voice called out from behind, "Grandpa!" Jace stopped and turned. Theo ran to hug a gray-haired man, sharp-tongued but gentle with the boy. The man bent down and patted Theo's head with a warmth he rarely felt. Jace recognized him immediately. Richard Kingsley, the billionaire real estate developer behind iconic structures across America, a name he knew only from newspapers and industry gossip. As Richard looked up, his sharp gaze sweeping over Jace, he felt a quiet shock spread through his body. This meeting was no coincidence. Richard stepped forward, his strong hand outstretched. "Jace Carter?" Jace shook her hand, his grip firm and cold. "Yes." "I heard you saved my nephew," Richard said, his voice low but authoritative. "It was just the timing," Jace replied, his voice calm. Richard smiled, an unreadable smile. "The right people at the right time are not random." Jace didn't answer, waiting. Richard continued, "You're an architect?" "How do you know?" Jace frowned. Richard shrugged. "I have a habit of learning about remarkable people." Jace looked slightly annoyed but kept quiet. Richard asked, "Where do you work?" "It used to be Hudson & Co.," Jace replied blandly. "It isn't anymore." Richard nodded as if he knew. "I heard you were betrayed." Jace clenched his fists but remained calm. "Old news." Richard looked at him for a moment, then suddenly said, "So do you want to work for me?" Jace froze, looking straight at Richard, searching for any sign of mirth, but his eyes were serious, unwavering. "The new headquarters for Kingsley Holdings," Richard explained. "I need an architect who is creative, risk-averse, and knows how to handle a crisis." "You proved that on the flight." Jace took a deep breath, his mind reeling. This was an opportunity he hadn't dreamed of a few hours ago. A way out of failure, a chance to rebuild his reputation. But he also knew that working with Richard Kingsley would never be easy. It was a world of power, of intrigue, of pressure. He looked at Theo. The boy stood beside his grandfather, eyes bright with hope, as if asking for his approval. Jace remembered the days he had been rejected, the opportunities he had missed because of fear. This time he did not want to make the same mistake. "Okay," he said, his voice firm. "I accept." Richard smiled, a satisfied smile. "Good, we'll discuss the details later." Vivian interjected, her voice sarcastically. "Interesting. From loser to my father's man overnight." Jace glanced at her, shrugging. "At least this time I choose my own path." Vivian raised an eyebrow, but didn't reply. Theo suddenly took Jace's hand, tugging gently. "Are you really going to work with Grandpa?" Jace leaned down and nodded. "Yeah, kid. It seems so." The boy smiled, his first smile, bright as sunlight through the clouds. A few weeks later, Jace stood in the luxurious conference room of Kingsley Holdings. In front of him were the blueprints he had been working tirelessly to complete. The light from the large glass windows illuminated the lines he had drawn. each detail bearing the mark of creativity and determination. Richard sat opposite, his sharp eyes scanning each drawing, not missing a single line. Jace clasped his hands under the table, waiting. He never thought he'd be standing here, not after what happened at Hudson & Co., where his colleagues betrayed him, where his dreams were crushed. But now, he wasn't a failure. He was part of something bigger. Richard put down the drawing and nodded. "I like the way you think. Good job." Jace breathed a sigh of relief, a small smile crossing his face. The door to the conference room opened, and Theo ran in, a large cup of coffee in his hand. "Uncle Jace, I bought you this." Jace chuckled, taking the warm cup of coffee. "Thanks, kid." Richard watched the scene, the corners of his lips curling up slightly, a rare satisfaction. Vivian was also present, arms folded, observing Jace with an appraising gaze. Although she had not yet fully accepted him, she no longer considered him useless as before. Jace turned to look out the window at the city. New York stretched out before him, its towering buildings a symbol of ambition and opportunity. From nothing, a fateful flight, a boy, and a timely decision had brought him here. He clenched his coffee cup tightly, feeling warmth spread through his palms. He had lost everything, but now he had found his way. And this time, he vowed not to let anyone take it away.